The marketplace was alive with noise, a cacophony of alien languages and the hum of machinery filling the air. Stalls overflowed with strange goods, glowing fruits, shimmering fabrics, and intricate gadgets. But amidst the bustling crowd, one figure moved cautiously, keeping her head low. She was small, barely reaching the waist of most aliens in the market, with pale lavender skin that seemed to shimmer faintly in the sunlight. Her large, silver eyes darted nervously as she clutched a worn satchel against her chest. Every step she took seemed to draw disdainful glances. "Watch where you're going," barked a burly vendor, shoving her aside as she accidentally brushed past his stall. She stumbled but caught herself, muttering an apology that was lost in the chaos. The vendor sneered, muttering something about useless runts before turning back to his wares. Her name was Lorena, and this treatment was nothing new. She had grown used to the jeers and dismissive attitudes since she arrived on this colony. Her kind, the Enari, were rare and often seen as insignificant, but today was especially difficult. Her meager savings were almost gone, and she had hoped to buy just enough food to last the week. As she reached for a piece of fruit at a nearby stall, her hand trembled, and the fruit slipped from her grasp, rolling onto the dusty ground. A harsh laugh erupted from the vendor. "Clumsy and broke. Maybe you should try begging somewhere else." Lorena's cheeks burned with shame as she bent to retrieve the fruit, but before her fingers could reach it, a larger hand picked it up. She looked up to see a human, a tall man with a kind smile and warm brown eyes. "Here," he said, brushing the dirt off the fruit and placing it gently into her hand. His voice was steady, calm, and free of mockery. "Looks like you've had a rough day." Lorena blinked, unsure how to respond. Humans were uncommon on this colony, and she had never spoken to one before. She expected him to walk away after his small act of kindness, but instead, he knelt to her level, his smile unwavering. "Are you all right?" he asked, his gaze full of genuine concern. I'm fine," she stammered, clutching the fruit tightly. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but he seemed to hear her just fine. The vendor scoffed. "Why waste your time on her? She's nothing but trouble." The human's smile faded as he turned to the vendor, his expression hardening. "Trouble? She's just trying to get by like everyone else. Maybe you should mind your own business." The vendor muttered something under his breath, but didn't press further. Lorena stared at the human, astonished. No one had ever stood up for her before. He straightened and extended a hand. "I'm David. And you are?" She hesitated, her instincts screaming to avoid attention, but something about his presence made her feel safe. "Lorena," she said softly. "Nice to meet you, Lorena," David said with a grin. "You look like you could use a break. How about a warm meal? My treat." Lorena's eyes widened in disbelief. Was this some kind of trick? But there was no malice in his expression, only kindness. Against her better judgment, she nodded. David led her through the crowded market to a small, quiet cafe tucked away from the chaos. As they sat, he ordered food for both of them, chatting casually as if they were old friends. Lorena listened, her guard slowly lowering as his words filled the silence she had grown so used to. For the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps not everyone in this cruel world was the same. The cafe was a cozy refuge from the bustling chaos of the marketplace. Soft light bathed the room, casting a warm glow on the simple wooden tables and chairs. Lorena sat awkwardly, her small frame dwarfed by the oversized chair. She clutched her satchel tightly, her silver eyes scanning the room as if expecting someone to tell her she didn't belong. David placed a steaming bowl of soup in front of her, along with a plate of bread. "Eat up," he said, sitting across from her with his own needle. His voice was gentle but firm, as though he was determined to make her feel at ease. Lorena hesitated, her fingers brushing the edge of the bowl. The aroma was inviting, but she couldn't shake her wariness. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly, her voice barely audible over the soft hum of conversation in the cafe. David shrugged, taking a bite of bread. You looked like you needed a hand. Simple as that. Her gaze narrowed slightly. People don't usually help without wanting something in return. He chuckled, leaning back in his chair. Well, maybe humans are just built differently. Or maybe I just don't like seeing anyone pushed around. Lorena studied him for a moment, searching for any sign of deceit, but his expression was open and genuine. Slowly, she picked up the spoon and took a cautious sip of the soup. The warmth spread through her, and for the first time in what felt like ages, she allowed herself to relax. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice still tinged with disbelief. David smiled. "No need to thank me. Everyone deserves a little kindness." They ate in silence for a while, though it wasn't the uncomfortable silence Lorena was used to. It felt peaceful. She couldn't remember the last time she'd shared a meal with someone who didn't sneer at her or dismiss her entirely. After a while, David broke the silence. "So, what's your story, Lorena? What brings you to this corner of the galaxy?" Her grip on the spoon tightened, and she looked down at her bowl. "It's complicated," she said softly. "I'm not exactly welcome where I come from. And it seems I'm not welcome here either." David's brow furrowed, but he didn't press her. "Well, for what it's worth, you're welcome here. At least as far as I'm concerned." Lorena looked up, meeting his gaze. There was no pity in his eyes, only a quiet determination that made her feel, for the first time in a long while, that she wasn't entirely alone. "What about you?" she asked, curious despite herself. "Why are you here? Humans aren't exactly common on this colony." David smiled, a hint of mischief in his expression. "Ah, well, I'm a trader. I travel from planet to planet, selling a little bit of everything. This colony's a good place to pick up rare goods and make a few deals. Plus," he added with a wink, "it's always nice to meet interesting people." Lorena couldn't help the small smile that tugged at her lips. "Interesting. That's not what most people would call me." "Then most people don't know what they're talking about," David said firmly. "You've got more spirit than half the folks I've met in my travels." Her cheeks flushed a faint lavender, and she looked away, unsure how to respond. Compliments were as foreign to her as the humans sitting across the table. As they finished their meal, David leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Listen, if you're looking for work, I could use some help at my shop. Nothing fancy, just organizing goods, keeping track of inventory. What do you say?" Lorena blinked, taken aback. "You'd hire me?" "Why not?" David said with a grin. "You seem smart and capable, and I've got a feeling you'd surprise a lot of people if they gave you a chance." For the first time in what felt like forever, Lorena felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things were starting to change. The shop was small but well organized, tucked away in a quieter part of the colony. Shelves lined the walls, filled with all sorts of items: tools, fabrics, odd trinkets from distant planets, and a few jars of spices that gave the air a warm, earthy scent. Lorena stood in the doorway, her satchel clutched tightly to her chest, unsure if she was ready to take this step. David waved her inside, his easy smile breaking through her hesitation. "Come on, it's not going to bite. Well, maybe that jar of spikes in the corner, but we keep it sealed." Lorena blinked at the odd joke, then found herself smiling despite her nerves. She stepped inside, the cool air of the shop a welcome relief from the heat outside. "What exactly do you want me to do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. "Simple stuff," David said, gesturing to the shelves. "Organizing, keeping track of inventory, maybe helping with customers when you feel ready. Just take it one step at a time." She nodded, taking a deep breath. It sounded straightforward enough, but the idea of interacting with people still made her uneasy. Most of the colony residents didn't hide their disdain for her, and she wasn't sure she could handle more ridicule. David seemed to sense her hesitation. "Don't worry," he said gently. "You'll be fine, and if anyone gives you trouble, you let me know." His words were reassuring, but Lyrena couldn't help the flicker of doubt. Still, she nodded again and set her satchel down by the counter. "I'll do my best." The first task was simple, organizing a shipment of small tools that had just arrived. Lyrena focused on the work, her nimble fingers quickly sorting and placing each item where it belonged. The repetitive task calmed her, giving her a chance to settle into the space without overthinking. David watched from a distance, not hovering but keeping an eye on her progress. "You're a natural," he said after a while, his tone light and encouraging. Lyrena glanced at him, unsure how to respond. Compliments still felt foreign, but she managed a quiet "thank you" before returning to her work. As the day went on, a few customers trickled in. Lyrena stayed behind the counter, letting David handle the interactions while she observed. Most of the customers barely glanced her way, but one, a tall, reptilian alien with sharp features, paused and sneered. "You've hired that runt," the alien said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Good luck staying in business." David's easy demeanor shifted in an instant. He stepped closer to the counter, his expression hardening. "She's my employee," he said firmly. "If you've got a problem with that, you can take your business elsewhere." The reptilian alien huffed but didn't argue further, stomping out of the shop. Lyrena's hands trembled slightly as she rearranged a stack of fabric, trying to pretend she hadn't heard the exchange. David turned to her, his expression softening. "You okay?" She nodded, though her voice wavered as she spoke. "I'm used to it." "Well, you shouldn't have to be," David said, his tone resolute. "People like that don't know what they're talking about." Lyrena looked at him, surprised by the conviction in his voice. She had expected him to brush it off, to tell her to ignore it like everyone else always did. Instead, he stood up for her, just as he had in the market. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. David smiled. "Anytime. Now let's get back to work." By the end of the day, Lyrena felt an unfamiliar sense of accomplishment. The shop looked more organized than it had when she arrived, and for once, she felt like she had done something worthwhile. David handed her a small pouch of credits before she left, insisting it was payment for a job well done. As she stepped out into the evening light, Lyrena clutched the pouch tightly, her heart lighter than it had been in a long time. Maybe, just maybe, this could be a new beginning. The days in David's shop passed peacefully, with Lyrena finding comfort in her new routine. She grew more confident in her work, her delicate hands quickly mastering the organization of goods and inventory. Customers who weren't outright dismissive began to notice her quiet efficiency, and a few even offered polite nods of acknowledgement. It wasn't much, but it felt like progress. One afternoon, as Lyrena was arranging a shipment of intricate tools from a distant star system, the door chimed. She glanced up, expecting another customer, but the figure who entered sent a chill down her spine. The alien was tall and imposing, his dark blue uniform adorned with the insignia of the colony's authorities. His piercing yellow eyes scanned the shop before settling on her. Lyrena froze, her fingers tightening around the tool she was holding. David stepped out from the back room, his easy smile faltering as he took in the tension in the room. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone polite but wary. The official didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped closer to the counter, his gaze never leaving Lyrena. "You," he said, his voice sharp and commanding. "You are Lyrena of the NRA, correct?" Lyrena's heart pounded in her chest. "Ah, yes," she managed, her voice barely audible. The official sneered. "You're under suspicion of harboring forbidden knowledge and fleeing justice. You will come with me immediately for questioning." David frowned, stepping between them. "Hold on," he said firmly. "What's this about? She's been working here, not causing any trouble." The official's gaze shifted to David, his expression unreadable. "This is none of your concern, human. Step aside." David didn't budge. "If you're accusing her of something, you'd better have proof. Otherwise, this sounds a lot like harassment." The tension in the room thickened as the official's eyes narrowed. "Do not interfere, human. You have no authority here. David crossed his arms, his stance unwavering. Maybe not, but I do have a right to know why one of my employees is being dragged off without an explanation. Larena's breath caught as the official's face darkened. She had seen this before, the contempt, the unchecked power. She braced herself for the worst, but to her surprise, the official took a step back. "This is not over," he said coldly, his gaze flicking between Lorena and David. "I will return with the necessary documents. Do not attempt to leave the colony." With that, he turned and strode out, the door slamming shut behind him. Lorena's knees threatened to buckle, and she gripped the edge of the counter for support. David placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "You okay?" he asked softly. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice shaking. "He's not wrong. I did leave my home, but not because I broke the law." David nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Then why?" Lorena hesitated, the memories she had buried surfacing against her will. "My family. They were accused of treason. It was a lie, but the punishment was exile or death. I fled to survive." David's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. Lorena continued, her voice trembling. "I thought I could disappear here, but it seems someone wants me to pay for something I didn't do." David leaned against the counter, his gaze steady. "Then we'll figure this out. There has to be a way to clear your name." Lorena blinked at him, stunned. "Why would you help me? You've already done so much." "Because it's the right thing to do," David said simply. "And because you're my friend." Her chest tightened at the word, a mix of gratitude and disbelief washing over her. She had never had a friend before, let alone someone willing to stand up for her. As the day turned to evening, Lorena found herself feeling something unfamiliar. Hope. David's unwavering support made her believe, for the first time, that she might not have to face her past alone. The shop felt quieter than usual the next morning, though Lorena wasn't sure if it was the actual stillness or the weight of her thoughts. She couldn't shake the image of the official's cold eyes or the lingering threat in his voice. Her hands trembled slightly as she arranged a shelf of small mechanical parts, but she forced herself to focus. David entered from the back room, carrying a box of new inventory. He glanced at Lorena and frowned. "You've been quiet," he said, setting the box down. "Still thinking about yesterday?" Lorena hesitated, then nodded. "I don't know what's going to happen. If he comes back with documents, I don't think I can stop him." David leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "Then we need to get ahead of this. If your family was framed, there has to be evidence somewhere." She looked up at him, a spark of hope breaking through her fear. "The Galactic Council archives," she said slowly. "They keep records of all trials and accusations. If there's proof, it would be there." David's eyes lit up. "Then that's where we'll go." Lorena blinked in surprise. "You'd come with me?" "Of course," David said, as if the answer was obvious. "You think I'm just going to sit here and let that guy drag you off without a fight?" A flicker of doubt crossed her face. "It's dangerous. The archives are in the capital, and the council doesn't take kindly to people snooping around." David grinned, his confidence unwavering. "Good thing I'm great at snooping." Despite herself, Lorena felt a small smile tug at her lips. His optimism was contagious, and for the first time in days, she felt like she wasn't completely alone. By midday, they had closed the shop and prepared for their journey. David packed a small bag with essentials, while Lorena gathered the few belongings she had. As they left the shop, she glanced back, wondering if she would ever see it again. The colony's bustling streets soon gave way to the outskirts, where the towering buildings shrank into sparse, dusty plains. David led the way to a small transport vehicle, its battered exterior disguising the advanced tech hidden within. "Is this yours?" Lorena asked, eyeing the vehicle skeptically. "Bought it off a guy who owed me a favor," David said with a shrug. "It's not much to look at, but it gets the job done." As they climbed inside, Lorena settled into the passenger seat, her nerves bubbling beneath the surface. David powered up the transport, and with a low hum, it lifted off the ground, gliding smoothly above the dirt road. The journey to the capital was long, the barren landscape stretching endlessly around them. For a while, they traveled in silence, the rhythmic hum of the transport lulling Lorena into a strange sense of calm. "You ever think about going back?" David asked suddenly, breaking the quiet. Lorena turned to him, startled by the question. "Back to my home planet?" He nodded. "Yeah, if things were different, I mean." She considered the idea, her gaze distant. "I used to dream about it," she admitted. "But even if I cleared my name, I don't think I could go back. It wouldn't feel like home anymore." David glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes home isn't where you're from. It's where you feel like you belong." His words lingered in the air, heavier than the hum of the transport. Lorena didn't respond, but deep down, she wondered if she had already begun to find a new kind of home in David's shop, in his unwavering kindness. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they approached the outskirts of the capital. The towering spires of the city glowed faintly in the distance, a stark contrast to the desolation they had left behind. Lorena's heart raced as the transport slowed, the weight of their mission pressing down on her. The Galactic Council archives loomed ahead, a fortress of secrets that could either save her or seal her fate. David parked the transport and turned to her, his grin steady despite the tension. Ready to make history. The Galactic Council archives were an imposing structure, towering high into the capital's skyline. Its sleek, metallic walls gleamed faintly under the city lights, giving it the appearance of an impenetrable fortress. Lorena hesitated at the entrance, her pulse quickening as she took in the armed guards and the constant surveillance drones hovering nearby. David stood beside her, his casual confidence a stark contrast to her unease. "Relax," he said with a grin. "We're just a couple of harmless researchers, right?" Lorena glanced at him, unable to hide her doubt. "This place doesn't exactly welcome harmless researchers. What if they don't let us in?" David pulled out a sleek data pad and winked. "That's why I came prepared." She didn't ask what prepared meant, but the mischievous glint in his eye gave her a sliver of reassurance. With a deep breath, she followed him toward the main entrance. Inside, the air was cool and sterile, the quiet hum of machinery filling the vast hall. Rows upon rows of data terminals stretched as far as the eye could see, each one glowing with the faint blue light of countless files. A few officials wandered the area, their eyes fixed on their tasks, but no one paid them much attention. David approached the central reception desk, where a bored-looking clerk barely glanced up. "Purpose of visit?" the clerk asked, his tone flat and uninterested. "Research," David said smoothly, placing his data pad on the counter. "We're looking into old legal records for an academic project." The clerk tapped a few keys on his terminal, glancing at the pad. "Access to restricted files requires clearance." David leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "Come on, mate. We're just historians trying to make sense of ancient bureaucracy. Surely you can make an exception." The clerk frowned, but before he could respond, David slid a small credit chip across the counter. The clerk's expression softened as he pocketed the chip, muttering something about annoying researchers before typing a few commands. "Access granted," the clerk said grudgingly. "Terminal 17, aisle 12. Don't cause any trouble." David flashed a grin. "Trouble? Us? Never." Lorena let out a shaky breath as they reached the terminal, her heart pounding in her chest. "You bribed him," she whispered, equal parts impressed and horrified. "Think of it as a tip for good service," David replied, already scanning the terminal for relevant files. "Now let's find what we need before anyone gets suspicious." Lorena's hands hovered over the controls, her fingers trembling slightly. The interface was unfamiliar, but she quickly adjusted, navigating through the labyrinth of legal documents with David's help. They searched for records tied to her family's name, cross-referencing dates and accusations. After what felt like an eternity, Lorena froze, her breath catching. "Here," she said, pointing to a file. "This is it." David leaned closer, reading the summary. The file contained details of the charges against her family: treason, conspiracy, and collusion with enemy factions. But as they delved deeper, inconsistencies began to emerge. Key evidence had been redacted, and witness testimonies contradicted each other. "This doesn't add up," David muttered, his brow furrowing. "It's like someone wanted to make sure your family looked guilty, no matter what." Lorena's stomach churned as the realization sank in. "They were framed," she whispered, "and whoever did it was powerful enough to manipulate the council's records." Before they could process the information further, a sharp voice interrupted them. "What are you doing here?" They turned to see a stern official flanked by 2 guards, his expression cold and suspicious. Lorena's blood ran cold as the guards stepped closer, their hands hovering near their weapons. David straightened, his easy demeanor returning despite the tension. "Researching legal history," he said with a charming smile. "Fascinating stuff, really." The official's gaze hardened. "Your access is revoked. Leave now or face the consequences." David nodded slowly, his tone calm. "Of course. Just finishing up here." He turned to Lorena, whispering under his breath, "Save the file and let's go." Her hand shook as she downloaded the file onto their data pad, the weight of the guard stares making every second feel like an eternity. Once the download was complete, they stepped away from the terminal, the guards following them closely until they exited the building. Outside, Lorena exhaled a shaky breath, her grip on the datapad tight. That was too close. David grinned, his confidence undiminished. "But we got what we came for. Now we have proof." She looked at him, a mixture of gratitude and awe filling her chest. For the first time, she began to believe they might actually stand a chance. The transport hummed quietly as it sped away from the Galactic Council archives, its sleek frame cutting through the darkened streets of the capital. Lorena clutched the data pad tightly against her chest, her heart still racing from their narrow escape. Beside her, David sat in the pilot's seat, his usual easy grin replaced by a focused, determined expression. "We did it," Lorena murmured, her voice barely audible over the engine's hum. "We actually found the proof." David glanced at her and gave a small nod. "Yeah, but we're not out of the woods yet. Whoever framed your family won't be happy about this." The weight of his words settled over her like a heavy cloak. She knew he was right. The powerful forces that had orchestrated her family's downfall wouldn't hesitate to silence her if it meant keeping their secrets buried. The transport suddenly jolted, throwing Lorena forward in her seat. Alarms blared, and David cursed under his breath, his hands flying over the controls. "What's happening?" Lorena asked, panic rising in her voice. "We've got company," David said grimly, nodding toward the rearview display. 2 sleek black crafts were closing in on them, their weapons glowing faintly in the dim light. Lorena's stomach twisted. "They're from the council, aren't they?" "Looks like it," David replied. "And they're not here for a friendly chat." He slammed the controls forward, and the transport shot ahead, weaving through the narrow streets of the capital. The pursuing crafts opened fire, bright streaks of energy lighting up the night. David's transport swerved sharply, narrowly avoiding the blasts. "Hold on," David shouted as he veered into a side alley, the transport skimming dangerously close to the walls. Lorena clung to her seat, her knuckles white as she tried to steady her breathing. "What do we do? We can't outrun them forever." David gritted his teeth, his eyes scanning the streets ahead. "We don't have to outrun them. We just need to lose them long enough to disappear." He turned sharply again, the transport diving into an underground tunnel. The sudden darkness was disorienting, and Lorena's heart pounded as she heard the faint hum of the pursuing crafts behind them. David's fingers danced over the controls, activating a cloaking mechanism. The transport shimmered briefly before disappearing from view, blending seamlessly with the shadows of the tunnel. The pursuing crafts flew past, their lights scanning the darkness but finding nothing. David let out a breath of relief, slowing the transport to a crawl. "They'll circle back," he said, his voice low. "We need to lay low until they move on." They parked the transport in an abandoned maintenance bay, the faint hum of the city above filtering down through the cracks in the ceiling. Lyrena sat on a crate, her hands still trembling as she stared at the datapad in her lap. "We almost died," she said quietly, her voice shaking. "But we didn't," David replied, crouching beside her. "And now we have what we need to fight back." Lyrena looked at him, her silver eyes filled with doubt. "David, what if this isn't enough? What if they destroy the evidence before we can use it?" David placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "Then we make sure they can't. We'll find someone who can help us. Someone with enough influence to force the council to listen." Lyrena's gaze softened, her fear slowly giving way to determination. She didn't know where David's unwavering confidence came from, but she couldn't help but trust him. He had risked everything to help her, and she wasn't going to let his efforts go to waste. "Okay," she said, her voice steadier now. "Let's do this." David grinned, his usual lightheartedness returning. "That's the spirit. Now, let's figure out our next move." As they planned their next steps, the danger they faced loomed heavy in the background. But for the first time, Lyrena felt like she had a chance, a real chance, to clear her family's name and find justice. And no matter how daunting the road ahead seemed, she knew she wasn't walking it alone. The transport glided quietly into the outskirts of the capital, stopping in front of a dimly lit building with a towering spire. The structure was worn but sturdy, its rough exterior hiding the significance of what lay inside. Lyrena stepped out of the transport, clutching the datapad like a lifeline, her nerves jangling with anticipation. "Are you sure this is the place?" she whispered, glancing at David. He nodded, his expression serious. "If anyone can help, it's her. Senator Elena has a reputation for rooting out corruption. If she believes us, we have a shot." Lyrena swallowed hard and followed David to the door. He pressed a button on the intercom, and a sharp voice crackled through. "Who is it? And why are you here?" "David, a traitor from the outer colonies. I have information about a council conspiracy." "It's urgent," he said, his tone calm but firm. There was a long pause before the door buzzed open. "Come in." Inside, the building was stark but functional, with rows of desks and terminals glowing faintly in the low light. A tall woman with sharp features and piercing green eyes stood in the center of the room, her arms crossed. She radiated authority, and her gaze was fixed on David and Lyrena as they approached. "You have 2 minutes," she said bluntly. "Speak." David wasted no time, handing over the datapad. "This is evidence proving the council falsely accused Lyrena's family of treason. Their names were smeared, their lives destroyed, and the ones responsible are still in power." Senator Elena's expression didn't change as she scanned the files. Her eyes flicked over the screen, her sharp mind piecing together the implications of the documents. "This is damning," she said finally, her voice low. "But it's also dangerous. If the council discovers you have this, they'll do everything in their power to silence you." "They've already tried," Lyrena said, stepping forward. Her voice was steady despite the tremor in her hands. "But I won't run anymore. My family deserves justice." Elena studied her for a moment, her gaze softening slightly. "Brave words. But bravery alone won't win this fight." She turned to David. "You've risked a lot to bring this to me. Why?" David shrugged, his easy smile returning. "Someone has to stand up to bullies. Besides, Lyrena's a friend. That's reason enough." The senator's lips twitched in the faintest hint of a smile. "Very well. I'll help. But this won't be easy. The council's power runs deep, and exposing this will put us all in danger." Lyrena nodded. "I understand. I'm ready." The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. Elena mobilized her trusted allies, a small but dedicated group of officials and activists who believed in exposing the corruption festering within the council. They worked tirelessly, verifying the data and preparing it for public release. As the sun began to rise, Lorena found herself standing on a balcony overlooking the city. The soft light bathed the capital in a golden glow, and for the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope. David joined her, leaning against the railing. "Not bad, huh?" he said, gesturing to the view. She smiled faintly. "It's beautiful. I just hope we're doing the right thing." "We are," David said firmly. "No matter what happens, the truth deserves to come out." Before she could respond, Elena appeared behind them. "It's time," she said. "The broadcast is ready." In a secure room filled with terminals and cameras, Elena stood at the center, flanked by David and Lorena. As the broadcast began, her voice carried across the galaxy, her words cutting through the silence like a blade. She detailed the corruption, presenting the evidence with unshakable conviction. She named names, laid out the crimes, and demanded justice. The reaction was immediate, the transmission spreading like wildfire. Lorena's heart pounded as she watched the comments flood in, messages of outrage and support pouring from every corner of the galaxy. For the first time, the tide seemed to be turning in her favor. David leaned closer, whispering, "This is it. They can't ignore this." Lorena nodded, her chest swelling with a mixture of relief and determination. Justice was no longer a distant dream. It was within reach. And with David and Elena by her side, she knew they had the strength to see it through. The broadcast shook the galaxy. For hours after its release, the Galactic Council was silent, the usual hum of political chatter replaced by a deafening void. But the silence didn't last long. As the evidence circulated and public outrage grew, the council was forced to respond. David and Lorena sat in a dimly lit room with Senator Elena, watching the live feed from the council chambers. The air was heavy with tension as the accused officials tried to defend themselves. Their voices wavered under the weight of undeniable proof, their arguments crumbling like sandcastles against the tide. "This is only the beginning," Elena said, her voice steady but laced with determination. "The council will try to save face by punishing the guilty, but real change will take time." Lorena nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "At least the truth is out. That's more than I ever thought possible." David grinned, leaning back in his chair. "Not bad for a day's work." Later that evening, as the galaxy's attention remained fixed on the unfolding scandal, Lorena and David returned to the quiet safety of their transport. The night sky above the capital was clearer than it had been in days, the stars twinkling like tiny beacons of hope. Lorena sat on the edge of the transport's ramp, gazing up at the stars. The weight that had pressed on her chest for years felt lighter now, though traces of uncertainty remained. Clearing her family's name was a monumental victory, but it didn't erase the pain of what they had endured. David joined her, handing her a steaming cup of something warm and comforting. "You did it," he said, sitting beside her. "Your family's name is restored. They can't take that from you." She took a sip, the heat spreading through her chest. "I couldn't have done it without you." He shrugged, his trademark grin returning. It was a team effort. You were the heart of it." Lorena smiled, a genuine warmth spreading across her face. "Thank you, David, for everything. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "You don't have to," he said softly. "That's what friends do." The word friend still felt new to her, but it no longer felt foreign. For the first time in her life, she understood its meaning, not just as a word, but as a feeling. The following weeks were a whirlwind of change. The accused officials were stripped of their positions, and an investigation into the council's corruption was launched. Senator Elena, emboldened by the public's support, became a leading voice for reform. Lorena found herself at the center of it all, her story inspiring countless others who had been silenced or overlooked. Though the attention was overwhelming at times, she embraced it, determined to honor her family's legacy. But as the dust began to settle, she realized that her journey wasn't over. The colony where she had sought refuge was still home to countless others like her, outcasts, refugees, and the forgotten. She saw herself in their faces, their struggles mirroring her own. One evening, as she and David stood outside the shop, she turned to him with a determined look. "I want to turn this place into something more," she said. "A refuge for those who don't have anywhere else to go." David raised an eyebrow. "A refuge?" She nodded. "A place where people like me can feel safe, where they can rebuild their lives." David's grin widened. "Sounds like a great idea. Count me in." Months later, the shop had transformed into a bustling hub of activity. What was once a quiet trading post now teemed with life. Workers sorting goods, children laughing, and travelers sharing stories. Lyrena oversaw it all with quiet confidence, her once timid demeanor replaced by a calm strength. David watched from the counter, his pride evident as he saw Lyrena thrive. "Told you you'd surprise people," he said as she walked past. She paused, smiling at him. "I had a good teacher." As the evening set in and the shop began to quiet, Lyrena looked out at the stars. Her journey had been long and filled with hardship, but it had led her here, to a place where she could finally make a difference. For the first time in years, she felt like she belonged. And for the first time ever, she looked to the future with hope.